To the FBI, Bumpy Johnson was a monster, a cold-blooded kingpin who built an empire on violence and fear. But on a quiet spring night in 1964, this monster did something that the entire New York legal system refused to do. He didn't pull a gun for money. He didn't break the law for territory. He stopped his entire world just to save the life of an innocent boy he had never even met. Why would a man with so much blood on his hands care about justice? The answer is more complicated than you think. Ruth Robinson stood under the street lamp on 135th Street, clutching a crumpled arrest warrant like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She was a housekeeper, 42 years old, worn down by 3 jobs and a lifetime of watching the system grind people like her into dust. Tonight, that system had come for her son, Marcus. Marcus Robinson Jr. was 19, but his mind was still a child's. He didn't understand Miranda rights or plea deals. He only knew that men with badges had taken him into a room, kept him there for 22 hours without food or water, and told him he'd never see his mother again unless he signed a paper. So he signed. And just like that, a boy who'd never left Brooklyn became the prime suspect in a double homicide across the river. When Bumpy Johnson approached Ruth, he didn't just see a grieving mother. He saw a broken contract. In Harlem, the police weren't protectors. They were an occupying force. And when the official law fails so completely, people don't just give up on order, they look for it somewhere else. They look for a big man. Sociologists call it the parallel state. It's what happens when the government leaves a vacuum and someone like Bumpy steps in to fill it. He wasn't helping Ruth out of pure charity. He was paying a tax, the tax of power. To be the king of Harlem, Bumpy had to provide the one thing the city wouldn't: justice. "They're killing my baby," Ruth whispered, sliding down the precinct wall until she hit the concrete. "They say he killed 2 women, but he was home. He was right here." Bumpy listened. He knew the game. The newspapers were screaming about the career girl murders, demanding a culprit. The NYPD needed a body to close the file, and a slow-witted black kid with no alibi was the perfect offering. It wasn't about truth. It was about closing the books. "Ma'am," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady, "go home. Get some sleep." He pressed a crisp $100 bill into her shaking hand. Not as a gift, but as a down payment on a promise. "I'll handle it." Ruth looked at him, confused. "Why? You don't even know us." Bumpy adjusted his coat. "Because in this neighborhood, we protect our own." But the truth was sharper than that. Bumpy knew that if he let the system devour Marcus Robinson without a fight, his own authority would bleed out with him. This was a performance, a message to the streets, to the cops, and to every soul in Harlem that the real law didn't wear a badge. It wore a tailored suit and answered to the name Bumpy Johnson. The next morning, the back room of a Lenox Avenue soul food joint became a war room. Bumpy didn't summon soldiers. He summoned specialists. Frank Lucas, 34 years old and hungry, was the muscle. Nat Pettigrew, an ex-cop pushed out for honesty, was the intelligence. And Madame Stephanie Street Claire, the numbers queen herself, was the network. She knew every judge, clerk, and beat cop from 110th to 155th Street. "We aren't just looking for a killer," Bumpy told them, his voice scraping against the quiet hum of the restaurant. "We're looking for the reason why." Frank leaned forward, tapping a cigarette on the table. "Boss, it's the career girl murders. The papers say this kid Marcus signed a confession. Why are we chasing ghosts?" Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "Because the math doesn't add up." This is where the story shifts from a simple frame-up to something darker. Systemic efficiency. In public administration, there's a concept called Campbell's law. It states that when a metric becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. The NYPD wasn't necessarily evil. They were desperate. The murders of Sarah Bennett and Lisa Carter had terrified the Upper East Side. The mayor was screaming for results. The district attorney needed a clearance rate to show the voters. When the system is under that kind of pressure, it stops looking for the truth and starts looking for a solution. And Marcus Robinson, poor, black, and mentally slow, was the perfect solution. He was a puzzle piece that could be hammered into place to complete the picture. They kept him in that room for 22 hours, Nat said, reading from a notebook he'd pulled from his coat. No lawyer, no phone call. They showed him photos of the 57 stab wounds and told him exactly what to write. Stephanie Saint. Claire let out a low, bitter laugh. They're manufacturing a conviction, Bumpy. It's an assembly line, and once that line starts moving, it doesn't stop for innocence. Bumpy stood up, the joints in his knees popping like dry wood. Then we break the machine. Frank, you hit the streets. Find me the witness the cops ignored. Nat, dig into the lead detective, Sullivan. Find out who he owes money to. And Stephanie, get me a lawyer who isn't afraid to lose his license. The race wasn't just against time. It was against the momentum of a bureaucracy that had already decided the outcome. Bumpy Johnson, a man who lived outside the law, was now the only thing standing between a manufactured lie and the cold, hard truth. The investigation moved with the terrifying speed of organized crime. In the legal world, discovery takes months. In Bumpy Johnson's world, it took 3 days. Frank Lucas didn't knock on doors. He applied pressure. He tracked down the doorman of the Upper East Side apartment, a terrified immigrant who had seen a white man with a scar leave the building covered in blood. The police hadn't interviewed him because his story didn't fit their narrative. Frank made sure his story would be heard. Meanwhile, Nat Pettigrew was peeling back the layers of the NYPD. He found the rot at the center of the 28th precinct, Detective Frank Sullivan. Sullivan wasn't just cutting corners. He was on the payroll of the Genovese crime family. And the man he was protecting, the man with the scar, was a low-level junkie burglar named Johnny Mancini. Finding Mancini was the easy part. He was shivering in a shooting gallery on the Lower East Side. Frank dragged him into an alley, not to beat him, but to offer him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Bumpy was waiting with a tape recorder. "You talk into this machine," Bumpy said, his voice flat and hard. "Or you answer to the people you stole from." For 45 minutes, Mancini spilled everything. The break-in, the panic, the 57 stab wounds, and the cover-up orchestrated by Detective Sullivan. The tape captured the sound of a man dissolving under the weight of his own guilt. On May 10th, 1964, Bumpy Johnson walked into the Manhattan District Attorney's office. He didn't bring weapons. He brought something far more dangerous to a man in power: leverage. Beside him was David Coleman, a young civil rights attorney, carrying the affidavits and the reel-to-reel tape. The district attorney looked at Bumpy with disdain. "You're trespassing, Johnson. Get out." Bumpy didn't move. He simply pressed play. The room filled with the scratchy, undeniable voice of Johnny Mancini confessing to the murders of Sarah Bennett and Lisa Carter. The DA's face drained of color. He wasn't looking at evidence. He was looking at the end of his career. This is the moment where the boundary between criminal and lawman evaporated. In a courtroom, the DA held all the cards. But here, in this office, Bumpy held the joker. "You have a problem," Bumpy said, stopping the tape. "You have an innocent boy on death row, and you have a star detective who is protecting a cop killer. Now, you can release Marcus Robinson and arrest the real animal. Or I can play this tape for the New York Times." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a checkmate. The DA stared at the machine, then at the gangster. He realized that if he wanted to save the system's reputation, he had to obey the man who lived outside of it. Fear, not morality, turned the key. He picked up the phone. "Get me the precinct. Now." 5 days later, Marcus Robinson walked out of jail. The charges were dropped. The system had corrected itself, not because it wanted to, but because Bumpy Johnson had grabbed it by the throat and forced it to breathe. Ruth Robinson wept into Bumpy's chest outside the courthouse. Marcus was free. Years later, he would name his firstborn son Ellsworth, a quiet tribute to the man who gave him a second life. In the barber shops and church pews of Harlem, the story hardened into legend. It was proof that sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil with a badge. But before we let that warm feeling settle in, we need to look at the cold truth. Because stories like this, they are dangerous. They act like morphine. They numb the pain of a broken system without fixing the bone. If you strip away the Hollywood ending, you find the real case that inspired this legend, the 1,963 career girls' murders. The real Marcus was a 19-year-old named George Whitmore Jr., and, on the night he was interrogated, there was no Bumpy Johnson waiting outside. No tape recorder, no rescue. George sat alone for 20 hours. He signed a 61-page confession he didn't write, simply because he was terrified and exhausted. He spent years in prison before a journalist, not a gangster, finally proved his innocence. We cheer for Bumpy because it feels good to see a bully get punched in the mouth. It's vigilante justice. But a society that relies on the conscience of a crime boss to protect its children is a society on life support. Bumpy saved one boy that spring. But for every Marcus he saved, how many George Whitmores did the system grind into dust when no one was watching? The legend of Bumpy Johnson isn't a story about a hero. It's a tragedy about a world where the only way to get a fair trial was to make a deal with the underworld. Bumpy Johnson walked back into the shadows that night, leaving Harlem with a difficult truth. We can admire the man who stopped for a scream, but we cannot accept the world that forced him to do it. Justice shouldn't be a favor granted by a crime boss. It should be a guarantee written in stone. If you believe that justice must be a right, not a lottery, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to know the real history, not just the legend. And tell me in the comments, when the system fails today, who do we turn to? I'll see you in the next story.